Welcome to the Undercover Insights channel. Today I'm going to tell you about the story. Late one night, Mayor Nia Caldwell was ambushed by two corrupt officers, determined to silence her fight for justice. Beaten but unbroken, she uncovered a system of lies, corruption, and racism. What she does next will shake the city to its core. Stay tuned for a story you won't forget. Monica Hayes, the first black female mayor of the historically divided city of Stonebrook, never anticipated the treacherous battles awaiting her. On her first night in office, she faced an attack that would alter the course of her leadership and ignite a movement. What she did next shocked the city and exposed a broken system. Watch until the end to see her inspiring journey of resilience and justice. Monica Hayes knew the magnitude of her victory was larger than herself. She wasn't just the first woman or the first black mayor of Stonebrook. She was the first leader elected on the promise of dismantling a long-standing legacy of systemic racism, corruption, and inequality. Her win wasn't just an election, it was a declaration from the people who had been marginalized and silenced for generations. But not everyone welcomed her triumph. Beneath the surface of celebratory headlines and community pride simmered resentment, hostility, and veiled threats. Her first day in office was anything but ceremonial. Monica strode into City Hall with the weight of generations on her shoulders, her presence commanding and intentional. Every step echoed with purpose as she entered the grand yet aging building, a place that had, for decades, been a symbol of power wielded against the people she now represented. She walked past portraits of former mayors, each one white, male, and staring out with an aura of entitlement, and took her place in the office that would now bear her name. The tension was immediate. Her staff, though officially welcoming, exchanged uneasy glances as she passed. The police department, in particular, had been vocal in their disdain during her campaign. Chief Earl McBride, a towering, silver-haired figure who had held his position for decades, had openly questioned Monica's qualifications. A product of an old guard, McBride was emblematic of the department's entrenched culture, one steeped in unspoken biases, unchecked authority, and whispered secrets. Monica's first challenge of the day was a meeting with McBride and senior department officials. She knew they were seething over her proposed reforms, which included mandatory de-escalation training, an independent oversight committee, and stricter accountability measures for officers accused of excessive force or racial profiling. For years, Stonebrook's black and brown residents had endured discriminatory practices under the guise of law enforcement, and Monica had promised to end it. As she entered the packed conference room, the air grew heavier. Uniformed officers exchanged knowing smirks, while others avoided her gaze entirely. McBride sat at the far end of the table, his steely eyes narrowed, arms crossed in a silent display of defiance. Monica greeted the room with calm authority, her every movement deliberate. She wasted no time diving into the agenda, presenting her proposals with clarity and conviction. "Our community is fractured," she began, her voice steady but firm. "Stonebrook's residents deserve to feel safe, all of its residents. That starts with trust, accountability, and fairness. These reforms aren't just policies. They're a promise to rebuild what's been broken." McBride leaned back in his chair, his lip curling into a smirk. "Mayor Hayes," he interrupted, his tone dripping with condescension, "while I respect your enthusiasm, you're new here. Policing isn't a PR campaign. We deal with real dangers every day, and these reforms, they tie our hands." Monica locked eyes with him, unflinching. "Chief McBride, no one is questioning the challenges your officers face, but the residents of this city have lived under policies that harm them more than protect them. It's time for that to change." The tension in the room escalated. An officer sitting to McBride's left muttered under his breath, loud enough for the room to hear, "She's just trying to play hero." Monica's gaze snapped to him. "Excuse me, officer." The man flushed, but remained silent. Monica turned back to McBride. "If you or your officers have concerns, I suggest addressing them directly instead of hiding behind muttered insults." McBride's smirk faltered, but he doubled down. "With respect, Mayor Hayes, you don't understand what it takes to lead on the streets. Theory and reality are two very different things." Monica leaned forward, her voice calm but sharp. "What I understand, Chief, is that for decades the reality you speak of has disproportionately targeted black and brown residents of this city. If you're unwilling to adjust to a new standard of justice, perhaps you should reconsider your position." The room erupted in whispers and gasps, the officers exchanging uneasy glances. McBride's face hardened, his jaw tightening as he stared her down. But Monica didn't waver. She had faced worse than smug glares and passive-aggressive commentary. Her childhood in a crumbling neighborhood taught her resilience, and her years as a community organizer had sharpened her resolve. As the meeting adjourned, McBride approached her, his voice low and venomous. "You don't belong here. People like you don't last." Monica met his glare head-on. "You're right. People like me don't last, because we don't settle for the status quo. Change is uncomfortable, Chief. Get used to it." What happened that evening would shake Stonebrook to its core. As Monica exited City Hall late at night, a shadow emerged from the alley, rushing toward her. It wasn't a robbery or a random attack, it was an act of intimidation. But Monica Hayes was prepared for war. What she did next would set off a chain of events that no one, especially Chief McBride, saw coming. Monica Hayes sat at the head of the conference room table, her presence commanding but calm. The light filtered through the tall windows of City Hall, casting long shadows across the faces of the officers and department heads gathered before her. Chief Edward Grayson, a man whose years on the force were etched into his weathered face, sat directly across from her, his posture rigid. The tension was palpable. Monica's voice, steady and deliberate, broke the silence. "These reforms are non-negotiable," she said, her tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. "If we are serious about building trust with this community, we must address the systemic failures that have plagued this city for decades." Grayson leaned forward, his eyes cold, his words measured but loaded with contempt. "Madam Mayor," he began, his voice thick with disdain, "are you aware of the consequences these changes could have on our officers? The risks they face every day will only increase if we're forced to second-guess every decision." Monica met his gaze without flinching. "I am fully aware, Chief Grayson, but I am also aware of the risks faced by the people in this city. People who feel unsafe not because of crime, but because of the very individuals tasked with protecting them. Change is difficult, but it is necessary." The room was silent, but the tension in the air was electric. Officers exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from thinly veiled annoyance to outright hostility. Grayson's jaw tightened as he looked away, signaling his disapproval without a word. The meeting pressed on, but the undercurrent of resistance was undeniable. Monica noticed the subtle signs, whispered asides, dismissive looks, and carefully worded objections disguised as concern for the city's welfare. It was a soft, insidious form of defiance, one that carried the weight of deeply entrenched biases. She had anticipated pushback, but the blatant disrespect in the room was a reminder of just how unwelcome her leadership was to some. As the meeting drew to a close, Monica stood, gathering her papers with deliberate precision. "I understand that these changes won't be easy," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But they are necessary if we want to move forward as a city. I suggest we all start thinking about solutions rather than obstacles." She left the room to a chorus of murmurs, feeling the weight of disapproval on her back. But she didn't let it show. She had faced worse than this before. Later that evening, Monica sat in her office, the quiet hum of the city below filtering through the window. She stared at the stack of reports on her desk, her mind replaying the day's events. The disapproving glares, the whispered criticisms, each one a reminder of the uphill battle she faced. But instead of discouraging her, they fueled her resolve. Her assistant, Rachel Bennett, stepped into the office, a concerned look on her face. "They're not just grumbling, Monica," she said, her voice low. "I'm hearing whispers about pushing back, and I don't mean through meetings or memos." Monica looked up, her expression steady. "Rachel, this isn't the first time people have tried to intimidate me. Let them whisper. It doesn't change the work we have to do." Rachel hesitated, her brow furrowed. "I know you're tough, but this feels different. These people aren't just unhappy, they're threatened." Monica offered a faint smile, hoping to reassure her. "They're threatened because they know their power is slipping, and that's exactly why we can't back down." Rachel nodded, but the concern lingered in her eyes. As she left, Monica turned her attention back to the reports, the weight of responsibility settling over her once again. The following days were relentless. Monica arrived at City Hall before dawn each morning, her determination unwavering, but the tension was becoming impossible to ignore. Police cars seemed to shadow her route to work, their presence unnerving. Officers on the street gave her sidelong glances, their expressions unreadable. The city itself felt like it was watching her every move. One morning, as Monica sifted through a stack of emails, Rachel entered the office again, her face pale. "Monica, I think you need to see this." She handed over a letter, the handwriting scrawled and angry. Monica read it silently, her jaw tightening with each word. The message was clear: leave now, or you'll regret it. Monica set the letter down, her face unreadable. "File this with the others," she said quietly. Rachel's eyes widened. "There are others?" Monica nodded. "This isn't new, Rachel. People like me, women, black women, we've faced these threats our whole lives. It's how they try to break us, but they don't know who they're dealing with." Rachel hesitated. "What if it escalates?" "It already has," Monica replied, her voice calm but resolute. "But if they think intimidation will stop me, they're wrong." That evening, as Monica left City Hall, the air felt heavier than usual. She scanned the street, her instincts on high alert. The shadow moved quickly, a figure emerging from the alley with deliberate speed. Monica froze for a moment before stepping back, her heart pounding. The man approached, his face obscured by a hood. "You're in over your head, Mayor," he growled. "People don't want your kind here." Monica squared her shoulders, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Is that supposed to scare me?" He stepped closer, but before he could act, Monica raised her phone, its screen glowing as she hit record. "Smile," she said coldly. "The whole city's watching." The man hesitated, his confidence faltering. Behind him, headlights swept across the street, and he darted back into the shadows. Monica exhaled, her resolve solidifying. She wasn't just fighting for her city, she was fighting for her survival, and she wouldn't back down. Monica Hayes leaned into her morning routine like it was a shield. Her daily jog through the serene paths of Central Park offered her a brief escape from the relentless tension of her role as the city's first black female mayor. But even here, her sense of peace was beginning to fray. The first time she noticed the parked police cruiser, she thought nothing of it. The second time, she told herself it was a coincidence. But by the third morning, as she passed two uniformed officers standing idly at the park entrance, their gazes tracking her every move, Monica knew better. They didn't say a word, but their silent scrutiny carried a message she couldn't ignore. The hostility from the police force was becoming personal, and it followed her everywhere. One morning, after her jog, Monica returned to her apartment and froze at her front door. Wedged beneath the frame was a folded piece of paper. Her pulse quickened as she bent to pick it up. The message, typed in stark block letters, read, "We know where you live. Watch your back." A chill coursed through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She stood on her doorstep, the note clutched in her hand, her mind racing. Her first instinct was to call the police, but the bitter irony of that idea stopped her cold. How could she trust the very institution where many harbored disdain or even hatred toward her? Instead, Monica stepped inside, locking the door behind her. She stared at the note for a long moment before crumpling it into her fist. She wouldn't let them see her fear. She had faced threats before, racist taunts during her campaign, whispered slurs from political adversaries, but she had never backed down. This would be no different. The next day, Monica slid the note into a drawer, locking it away both physically and mentally. She told no one, not even Rachel Bennett, her trusted assistant. Speaking about it would only make it real, and Monica refused to let fear dictate her actions. She carried on with her duties, maintaining her usual steady resolve. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of her focus. At City Hall, the atmosphere was thick with resistance. Meetings with city officials were increasingly tense. Some had taken to subtly undermining her decisions, couching their objections in faux concerns about the city's stability. In conference rooms, Monica caught sidelong glances, barely concealed smirks, and the kind of silent whispers meant to make her feel like she didn't belong. It was a quiet but deliberate form of exclusion, and Monica felt its sting every day. She couldn't help but think back to her childhood, watching her mother endure similar microaggressions. Back then, she hadn't fully understood the weight of those looks, the coded language, the quiet hostility that seeped into every interaction. But now, as an adult and a leader, Monica felt the full force of it aimed squarely at her. The breaking point came one tense afternoon during a meeting with the police department. Chief Edward Grayson, ever stoic and defiant, sat across from Monica, his hands clasped on the table like a man bracing for a fight. She presented her latest set of reforms, which included measures to address racial profiling and implement independent oversight. Monica knew these proposals would rattle the room, but she hadn't anticipated just how openly they would bristle at her. Grayson's expression was a mask of professional detachment, but his tone was sharp as a knife. "Madam Mayor," he began, his voice cold and clipped, "our officers are already under immense pressure. These reforms will destroy morale. We can't afford to have them second-guessing every decision they make in the field." Monica met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "Chief Grayson, trust between law enforcement and this community is at an all-time low. If we're serious about public safety, we must address these systemic issues. Accountability isn't an attack on morale, it's a commitment to integrity." Her words were met with silence. Grayson's jaw clenched as he looked away, his refusal to acknowledge her point blatant. Around the room, officers exchanged knowing glances. One younger officer, wiry and cocky, leaned back in his chair, his eyes gleaming with defiance. "Careful, Madam Mayor," he drawled, his tone casual but cutting. "Some people don't appreciate being put under a microscope." Monica's eyes locked onto his, her expression unwavering. "Some people don't appreciate abuse of power," she replied, her tone icy yet composed. The officer's smirk faltered, a flicker of anger flashing across his face before he looked away. The tension in the room was suffocating, but Monica refused to let them rattle her. She gathered her notes as the meeting concluded, her every move deliberate and measured. As she left the room, she felt their eyes on her back, their disdain hanging in the air like a storm cloud. That evening, Monica sat alone in her apartment, staring out the window at the city she had fought so hard to serve. The weight of the day pressed heavily on her, but she refused to let it break her. Instead, she thought of the people who had elected her, the single mothers, the students, the workers struggling to make ends meet. They were why she did this. They were why she wouldn't quit. She thought of the note still tucked away in her drawer. It was meant to intimidate her, to make her doubt herself, but all it had done was fuel her resolve. Monica Hayes didn't back down. She didn't let fear win, and if they thought they could silence her, they were in for a rude awakening. The hostility surrounding Monica Hayes was no longer veiled. Every day, her fight to reform a broken system grew more dangerous. It was clear her battle wasn't just against policies and entrenched bureaucracy, but against individuals who would go to any lengths to protect the status quo. That evening, Monica returned to her modest apartment, locking the door behind her, a precaution she rarely took, but now felt necessary. As the quiet of her living room enveloped her, she poured a glass of water and sank into her worn-out couch. The events of the day replayed in her mind. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept in. Could she truly reform a system so determined to reject change? Was the fight worth the cost? But as the doubt swirled, a spark of defiance ignited within her. She had come too far, endured too much to be intimidated now. She thought of the people who had elected her, the single mothers, the struggling workers, the young black students who saw her as proof that they too could break barriers. Monica clenched her fists, steeling her resolve. They were counting on her, and she wouldn't let them down. The following days were tense, yet Monica convinced herself that the threatening note she had found at her door was an empty warning. She kept her routine, arriving early at City Hall, meeting with her staff, and pushing her bold reforms. But beneath her calm exterior, unease gnawed at her. She felt the invisible eyes of her enemies watching her every move, waiting for her to slip. It was late one evening when the simmering tension boiled over into violence. Monica had stayed at City Hall reviewing plans for a community outreach event. By the time she packed up to leave, the clock read just past midnight. The halls were eerily silent, long since emptied of staff. Only a few dim lights flickered above as she exited the building and made her way to the dark, nearly deserted parking lot. As she walked across the cracked asphalt, the chilly night air bit at her skin. Her heels echoed against the ground, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. Halfway to her car, she caught movement from the corner of her eye. Two figures stepped out from behind a parked SUV, the gleam of their police uniforms unmistakable. Her heart began to race, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. "Evening, Mayor Hayes," one of them called, his voice carrying an unsettling mix of mockery and menace. Monica nodded politely and kept walking, attempting to brush past without confrontation. But one of the officers stepped directly into her path, blocking her way. "Leaving a little late, aren't we?" he asked, his tone casual, though his cold stare betrayed his true intent. "Yes," Monica replied evenly, her heart hammering in her chest. "I had a lot of work to finish. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get home." The officer chuckled, glancing at his partner. "A lot of work, huh? Changing a whole city can't be easy." His words dripped with sarcasm. Monica tried to sidestep, but his partner stepped closer. "You're making waves, Mayor," the second officer said, his voice low and menacing. "Not everyone's happy about that." Her pulse quickened, but she kept her tone steady. Change isn't always comfortable, but it's necessary. "Necessary for who?" the first officer sneered. He leaned in, his smirk twisting into something more dangerous. "You think you can just come in here and rewrite the rules? You don't belong here." Monica's instincts screamed that this was no idle confrontation. She glanced around the lot, searching for someone, anyone who might be watching, but it was empty. "Step aside," she demanded, her voice firm despite the fear creeping in. "I'm the elected mayor of this city and I won't be intimidated." The officer laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "Elected, huh? That badge on my chest means more than your title ever will. We run this city, not you." Before she could respond, he gave her a hard shove. Monica stumbled, barely catching herself. Her eyes blazed with defiance as she straightened. "Touch me again," she warned, her voice low but unyielding. But the second officer lunged forward, grabbing her arm in a grip so tight it felt like it might bruise. "You don't give the orders here, lady," he snarled, dragging her backward. Panic surged through Monica as she struggled to free herself. "Let me go!" she shouted, her voice echoing in the empty lot. She fought against his hold, but the officer's grip only tightened. "You don't get it, do you?" the first officer said, stepping closer. "You think you're untouchable, but out here, we make the rules." Monica's mind raced. She needed to stay calm, but the reality of the situation was stark. These men didn't care about laws or justice. They wanted to send a message, but Monica Hayes wasn't about to back down. "You're wrong," she said, her voice rising with defiance. "You might run from accountability, but I promise you, your time is coming." Her words struck a nerve. The officer holding her hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, but the other sneered, "Big talk for someone so out of their depth." Monica glared at him, unyielding. "You'll regret this." For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, faint footsteps echoed in the distance, a security guard approaching, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The officers froze, their arrogance faltering. Without another word, they released Monica and slinked back into the shadows. Monica stood frozen, her chest heaving as the guard approached. She realized the fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. But one thing was clear. She would not let fear break her. Nia Caldwell felt the searing pain with every ragged breath, her body dangling upside down, blood rushing to her head and throbbing against her temples. The two men, clad in their spotless uniforms, watched her with chilling satisfaction. The night air in the dimly lit parking lot was heavy, almost suffocating, amplifying the isolation. She could barely see through her swelling eyelids, but she could feel their looming presence, the predators circling their prey. "You really thought you could come into our city and change everything, didn't you?" Officer Russell sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. His pale face twisted with disdain as he crouched to her level, brushing dirt off his badge like it was sacred. "This is what happens when people like you overstep." Hanging by her ankles, Nia forced herself to meet his icy gaze, even as pain surged through her body. She could taste blood in her mouth, her jaw throbbing from where his partner, Officer Clay, had struck her. They wanted her fear. They wanted her submission, but Nia refused to give them that satisfaction. "This city doesn't belong to you," she rasped, her voice weak but defiant. "It belongs to the people, all the people, and they deserve better." Her words lit a fire in Russell's eyes, and without warning, he landed a kick to her ribs, sending fresh waves of agony through her battered frame. Clay joined in, laughing darkly as he hurled insults at her. "Better?" Clay mocked. "You think you're a savior? You think anyone wants you here? Look at you now, nothing but another loudmouth who doesn't know her place." Their blows were calculated, their cruelty methodical. Each punch, each kick was designed to remind her of what they saw as her transgression, daring to challenge a system built to keep people like her powerless. The assault dragged on until she was barely conscious, her mind a blur of pain and fleeting memories of the life that had brought her to this moment. Nia thought of her late mother, who had worked 2 jobs to provide for her while instilling in her an unshakable belief in justice. She thought of the promises she had made to the voters of Crestwood when they had elected her as the first black woman to lead their city. She thought of the community that still looked to her for hope, even as its institutions tried to crush her. And even as her strength waned, The fire within her refused to be extinguished. Hours passed. The stars above blurred as tears streamed down her bruised face. Just as she began to lose consciousness, faint footsteps echoed in the distance. She tensed, fear gripping her anew. Had they returned to finish the job? Instead, a panicked voice broke the silence. "Oh my God, are you okay?" A young man, no older than 20, emerged from the shadows, his eyes wide with shock as he took in her battered form. Nia tried to speak, but her voice came out as a broken whisper. I'll get you down," he stammered, his hands trembling as he worked to untie her ankles. The moment her body hit the ground, pain surged through her limbs, and she nearly blacked out again. The young man knelt beside her, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. "Don't move. Help is on the way," he said, his voice filled with urgency. As the sound of sirens pierced the stillness, Nia felt a flicker of relief. She had survived. But survival was not enough. As she closed her swollen eyes and let exhaustion claim her, one thought burned in her mind. They will pay for this. Nia awoke in a hospital bed, the sterile white walls stark against the darkness of her memories. Her ribs ached with every breath, and the bruises across her body bore testimony to the violence she had endured. Yet her spirit, though battered, was unbroken. Teresa Alvarez, her fiercely loyal chief of staff, sat at her bedside, her face a mix of relief and fury. "Nia," she whispered, her voice trembling, "do you know how close they came to—" Nia cut her off, her voice hoarse but resolute. "I'm still here. That's all that matters." Teresa's eyes brimmed with tears, but anger laced her tone. "This isn't just about you. They're sending a message to everyone who believes in what you're doing. We can't let this slide." "We won't," Nia replied, her gaze steady despite the pain. "But we'll do it the right way. No shortcuts. They want to scare me into silence, but they've only made me louder." Teresa nodded, her expression hardening. "Then we fight. Together." News of the attack spread like wildfire. Photos of Nia's bruised face and battered body ignited outrage across the city. Protests erupted, demanding accountability and justice. For too long, Crestwood's police force had operated with impunity, and the attack on the mayor was the final straw. Behind closed doors, Nia began planning her next move. She met with lawyers, activists, and community leaders, forming a coalition to confront the corruption that had festered for decades. The evidence would be gathered meticulously, and every individual complicit in the assault, directly or indirectly, would be held accountable. Meanwhile, Russell and Clay, emboldened by years of unchecked power, continued to operate as if they were untouchable. But Nia's silence was not submission. It was strategy. She was building her case, knowing that when she struck back, it would be with the full force of the law. As Nia lay in her hospital bed that night, the pain was a constant reminder of what she was fighting against. But the fire in her heart burned brighter than ever. This was no longer just her fight. It was a battle for the soul of her city, and she would not lose. Nia Caldwell sat in her hospital room, the bruises on her body aching with every breath, but her mind was sharp and focused. The corruption in Crestwood's police department had always been an open secret, but now it was personal. They had tried to silence her with violence, but instead they had ignited something they could never control. "We have to expose them," Nia said firmly to Teresa Alvarez, her chief of staff and closest ally. "But I can't do this alone." Teresa nodded, her face tense with concern. "Then we start building an army. People who believe in justice, people who won't back down." The two women began brainstorming potential allies, those who had been on the front lines of fighting systemic corruption long before Nia had been elected. There were community activists who had stood against police misconduct, journalists who had uncovered corruption in City Hall, and even officers within the department who had quietly expressed dissatisfaction with the system but were too afraid to speak out. The effort started small. Teresa worked tirelessly to reach out to trusted individuals, carefully vetting them before inviting them into their fold. The first to join was Damian Price, a well-known activist who had spent decades advocating for marginalized communities in Crestwood. Damian had seen the devastating impact of police brutality firsthand and had always been vocal about the need for change. "We've been fighting this fight for years," Damian said during one of their late-night meetings in a secluded community center. His voice carried the weight of years of struggle, but also a spark of hope. "With you leading this, we might actually break through their walls." Soon after, they recruited Rachel Lynn, an investigative journalist with a reputation for fearless reporting. Rachel had been following Nia's rise to power and was already suspicious of the police department's resistance to her reforms. "If we're going to take them down, we need evidence, undeniable proof," Rachel said, her notebook in hand. "Once the public sees the truth, they won't be able to ignore it." To Nia's surprise, whispers of dissent also emerged from within the police department itself. Officer Malik Grant, a young black officer who had grown disillusioned with the toxic culture of Crestwood PD, approached Nia through Damian. Nervous but resolute, Malik confided his struggles. "I've seen things I wish I could forget," Malik admitted during a clandestine meeting. His hands trembled as he spoke, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to be watching. "The intimidation, the cover-ups, it's worse than most people realize, but if they find out I'm talking to you, I'm done." Nia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll protect you. Your safety comes first. But if you're willing to help us, your insight could change everything." Malik began sharing details about the department's inner workings, the unspoken code of silence that punished anyone who dared to speak out, the backroom deals that shielded officers from accountability, and the fear tactics used to keep everyone in line. "They'll ruin your life if you step out of line," Malik warned. "But I can't keep quiet anymore. People are getting hurt." As the group's efforts intensified, their meetings became more frequent, but remained shrouded in secrecy. Damian worked to rally support from the community, organizing quiet discussions with those who had suffered under the department's heavy hand. Rachel tapped into her network of whistleblowers and anonymous sources, piecing together a damning trail of evidence. Meanwhile, Teresa coordinated their efforts, ensuring every document, testimony, and lead was meticulously preserved. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. They uncovered falsified reports, body camera footage that had been deliberately suppressed, and a pattern of targeting black residents under the guise of community safety. Malik even provided a list of names, officers who had actively participated in or enabled the attack on Nia. Despite their progress, the pressure was mounting. Rumors swirled around the city about Nia's extended absence from public life. Community members began to ask questions, and reporters hounded Teresa for answers. Each time, Teresa offered vague reassurances, deflecting attention while their case solidified. One evening, the group gathered in the basement of a church, far from prying eyes. Nia, still healing but determined, stood at the head of the table. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with anticipation. "We're close," Nia began, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "But we need to be ready for what's coming. When we go public, they will fight back. They'll try to discredit us, to silence us, maybe worse. If anyone has doubts, now is the time to walk away." The silence that followed was heavy. One by one, the members of the group met her gaze and nodded, their expressions resolute. They all knew the risks. They also knew the stakes were far too high to back down now. As the weeks went by, their network quietly expanded. More people came forward, including additional officers tired of the department's corruption. The group became a tight-knit team, united by their shared purpose. Every member brought something vital to the table, whether it was knowledge, connections, or the courage to speak out. But Nia was acutely aware of the danger they all faced. Her attack had been a warning, a brutal attempt to remind her who held the power in Crestwood. Yet it had also backfired, galvanizing a movement she hadn't realized she was capable of leading. "We're not just fighting for justice," Nia said during one meeting. "We're fighting to show this city that change is possible, that the people in power don't get to decide our fate. We do." The room erupted in quiet murmurs of agreement. Each person in that room knew the road ahead would be perilous, but they also knew they were on the precipice of something bigger than any of them had imagined. They were ready. Nia Caldwell sat at the head of a long wooden table in the dimly lit community center. Around her, the room was filled with her closest allies: Teresa Alvarez, her chief of staff; Rachel Lynn, the relentless investigative journalist; Damian Price, the respected activist; and Malik Grant, the brave whistleblower from within the Crestwood Police Department. The air was heavy with anticipation as they finalized their plan to expose the systemic corruption that had poisoned the city. "This isn't just about me anymore," Nia began, her voice steady despite the memories of her brutal attack still fresh in her mind. "This is about everyone who has suffered under their abuse of power. We've gathered the evidence. Now it's time to make sure the whole city knows the truth." Rachel leaned forward, her notebook open, pages filled with notes and timelines. "We have to be strategic. If we dump everything at once, it might overwhelm people, but if we release key pieces of evidence slowly, we can build momentum and force the department to respond." Damian nodded, his deep voice resonating in the room. "We need to make this a fight the community can rally behind. The more people who stand with us, the harder it'll be for them to cover it up." The group agreed on a multi-phased plan. They would leak evidence to trusted media outlets in stages, each revelation building on the last. The first story would highlight long-standing complaints against specific officers, including those involved in Nia's attack. It would set the stage for the more damning revelations to come. The following week, Rachel's article hit the front page of Crestwood's most-read newspaper. The story detailed years of complaints against officers, documenting instances of racial profiling, excessive force, and gross misconduct. Despite the allegations, these officers had faced no consequences, protected by a culture of impunity. Rachel's sources were airtight, backed by documents and testimonies that painted a chilling picture. The city erupted. Protests sprang up overnight, with hundreds of residents gathering outside City Hall and police headquarters. People were angry at being ignored, at being treated as if their lives didn't matter, and at a system that seemed designed to oppress them. Signs reading "Justice for All" and "No More Silence" filled the streets as chants of "Accountability Now" echoed through the city. From her hospital room, Nia watched the protests unfold on television. Her body still bore the marks of the attack, but her spirit was unshaken. She felt a mix of emotions: pride at seeing the community rise up and anger at the deep-seated corruption that had caused so much pain. As the public demanded answers, Police Chief Marvin Larson, a staunch defender of the department's status quo, took to the media. Standing at a podium surrounded by uniformed officers, he dismissed the allegations as misleading and sensationalized. "Our officers uphold the law with integrity," Larson declared, his voice calm but defiant. "These stories are an attack on the brave men and women who risk their lives every day. We will not allow outsiders to divide this city." But Rachel wasn't finished. A week later, she published a follow-up article that included eyewitness accounts from residents who had been victims of police abuse. Their stories were harrowing. A teenager beaten during a routine traffic stop, a mother detained for questioning after reporting a crime, and countless others who had been targeted simply because of their skin color. The accounts were raw emotional, and impossible to ignore. Inside the department, tensions were boiling over. Officers loyal to Larson and his authoritarian leadership doubled down, insisting on unity against what they called a smear campaign. Others, however, began to distance themselves, worried about being implicated. Malik reported whispers of fear and paranoia spreading through the ranks. "They're cracking," Malik told Nia during one of their covert meetings. But Larson still got a tight grip. No one wants to be the first to break ranks. The turning point came when a young officer named Daniel Torres reached out to Rachel through her anonymous tip line. His voice trembled as he explained his role on the night of Nia's attack. Though he hadn't participated, he had been there, ordered to keep watch while his colleagues brutalized her. The guilt had been eating away at him, and with the growing public outcry, he couldn't stay silent any longer. In a secret meeting, Daniel recounted the events of that night in excruciating detail. "They said she needed to be taught a lesson," he admitted, tears streaming down his face. "I should have done something, but I was too scared." Rachel recorded the confession, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. "You're doing the right thing," she assured him. "This will help bring justice, not just for Nia, but for everyone." The next morning, Rachel's article hit the front page. It included Daniel's testimony, corroborated by evidence the team had gathered. His confession was the smoking gun they needed, and the impact was immediate. The city was in an uproar. Protesters flooded the streets in even greater numbers, demanding Larson's resignation and a full investigation into the department. Nia's hospital room became a hub of activity. Teresa, Damien, Rachel, and Malik worked tirelessly to coordinate their efforts. As the public's fury grew, so did the pressure on City Hall. Officials who had once ignored Nia's warnings now scrambled to distance themselves from Larson and his officers. Under mounting pressure, the mayor's office announced a formal investigation into the police department. Independent auditors were brought in to examine years of records, while a special task force was established to oversee the probe. Larson's control began to slip, and officers previously loyal to him started speaking out, hoping to save themselves. Despite the progress, Nia knew the fight was far from over. Larson wasn't going down without a fight, and the department's deeply rooted corruption wouldn't be eradicated overnight. But the cracks were showing, and for the first time, real accountability felt within reach. One evening, as Nia sat in her hospital bed, Teresa brought her the latest updates. "They've suspended 3 officers involved in your attack," Teresa said, "and Larson's been called in for questioning." Nia nodded, her face calm, but her eyes blazing with determination. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We're not stopping until every last one of them is held accountable." Her words were a promise to herself, to the community, and to everyone who had ever suffered under the system's abuse. The battle wasn't over, but the tides were turning, and Nia Caldwell was ready to see it through to the end. Chief Harold Donovan, the stoic and defiant leader of the Crestwood Police Department, faced the cameras with a strained expression. The usual confidence in his voice faltered as he announced, "The department will cooperate fully with the investigation." His words, carefully chosen and devoid of sincerity, reflected a man desperately trying to maintain control. Behind his composed facade, the walls of his authority were crumbling, his empire built on intimidation and deceit starting to unravel. Meanwhile, Nia Caldwell's allies intensified their efforts. Rachel Lynn, the fearless investigative journalist, worked tirelessly alongside Malik Grant, the brave whistleblower from within the department. Together, they unearthed evidence of a corruption machine that operated with chilling efficiency. One evening, Rachel called for an urgent meeting, arriving with a thick folder of confidential emails. "These emails are a blueprint for corruption," Rachel declared, her voice steady but charged with emotion. She spread the printed documents across the table where Nia, Teresa Alvarez, Damian Price, and Malik leaned in to read. These exchanges between Donovan and his top officers reveal a coordinated effort to suppress complaints, discredit victims, and manipulate evidence. Damian scanned the pages, his face darkening with each revelation. "This isn't just neglect or incompetence," he said grimly. "This is a criminal conspiracy, a deliberate cover-up to protect their own." Nia's hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the documents. The language in the emails was cold, calculated, and ruthless. Officers who spoke out were blacklisted. Victims who sought justice were painted as liars. Evidence was altered to ensure officers implicated in misconduct were shielded from accountability. It was a damning portrait of a deeply entrenched system. "This is the proof we need," Nia said, her voice resolute. "We're taking this public. People need to see the depth of the corruption." The team worked methodically in the days that followed. Rachel coordinated with her media contacts to ensure the emails would be released to multiple outlets simultaneously. Damian mobilized community leaders and activists to prepare for the inevitable backlash, organizing a press conference to coincide with the leak. Malik, risking everything, helped the team anticipate the department's strategies to discredit them. When the day of the release arrived, Nia sat in her hospital bed, her heart pounding as the news broke. Every major news outlet in Crestwood ran the story. Leaked emails from Chief Donovan and his top officers revealing years of systematic corruption and abuse. The headlines were damning. "Blueprint for Corruption Emails Expose Police Department's Dark Secrets." The city erupted. Protests engulfed Crestwood streets, with thousands of residents demanding justice. Crowds gathered outside City Hall and police headquarters, their chants for accountability reverberating across the city. Signs reading "Justice for All" and "End Police Corruption Now" painted a vivid picture of the community's collective outrage. Chief Donovan scrambled to control the narrative. In a hastily arranged press conference, he stood before the media, flanked by loyal officers, and dismissed the emails as misinterpreted and part of a sensationalized media attack. His words rang hollow. The evidence was irrefutable, and the public's fury drowned out his weak denials. By the time he left the podium, his position was untenable. City Hall convened an emergency meeting. Nia's allies within the city's leadership pushed for immediate action, arguing that the department's credibility was irreparably damaged. By the end of the day, the decision was made. Chief Donovan was placed on administrative leave, and several officers implicated in the emails were suspended. It was a seismic shift, but for Nia, it was only the beginning. In the days that followed, Rachel published a series of follow-up articles exposing more layers of the department's corruption. Each story revealed new horrors, complaints ignored, victims silenced, and officers protected by a culture that valued loyalty over justice. Damian organized forums where residents shared their own stories of abuse, amplifying the voices of those who had suffered in silence for far too long. The movement grew. What began as a response to Nia's attack transformed into a citywide demand for reform. People who had once felt powerless found strength in their collective voice, standing together to confront a system that had oppressed them for decades. One evening, as Nia sat by her hospital window, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Teresa. Donovan resigned. They couldn't protect him anymore. For a moment, Nia let the words sink in. Donovan's resignation was a monumental victory, a sign that the system was beginning to crack. But she knew there were still battles to be fought. The department's corruption ran deeper than one man, and dismantling it would require relentless effort. The next morning, Nia addressed the city for the first time since her attack. Standing on the steps of City Hall, she faced a sea of supporters, their faces filled with hope and determination. Beside her stood Teresa, Damian, Rachel, and Malik. the allies who had fought alongside her every step of the way. "Thank you for being here," Nia began, her voice strong and unwavering. "Today, we stand united, not as individuals, but as a community. What happened to me was not just an attack on one person. It was an attack on the principles of justice, accountability, and equality. But together we have shown that we will not be silenced. We will not back down. We will demand better for our city." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the streets. Nia paused, letting the energy settle before continuing. "For too long, corruption and abuse have thrived in the shadows, but today we shine a light on that darkness. We demand accountability, not just for me, but for every person who has suffered under this broken system. This is only the beginning. Together, we will rebuild this city brick by brick into a place where justice truly means something." In the weeks following Donovan's resignation, Nia and her allies pushed forward with sweeping reforms. They established an independent oversight committee composed of community leaders and activists to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. The committee was a game changer, giving residents a direct role in holding the police accountable. New training programs focused on de-escalation, implicit bias, and community engagement were implemented. Officers resistant to change resigned in protest, but Nia remained resolute. She knew true reform required letting go of the old ways. City Hall began funding initiatives to revitalize neglected neighborhoods, creating community centers, after-school programs, and mental health resources. Nia believed that real public safety began with strong, supportive communities. One night, as Nia walked through a newly renovated park, she saw children laughing and playing, their parents watching from nearby benches. The city was healing, slowly but surely. Nia felt a deep sense of pride. The road ahead was long, but for the first time she believed Crestwood was on the right path. Her fight had sparked a movement, one that could not be silenced. And as long as she had breath in her body, Nia Caldwell would continue to fight for justice, for equality, and for the future her city deserved. The city of Crestwood was changing, its streets humming with a newfound energy. Families gathered in the newly refurbished parks. Neighbors greeted each other with warmth, and children played freely in spaces that had once been neglected. The shadows of corruption and injustice had not been erased, but they had begun to dissipate, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of hope. The newly established Oversight Committee was at the heart of this transformation. It wasted no time addressing cases that had long been buried in the department's files. Incidents of police misconduct that had been ignored for years were now investigated transparently, with the community involved at every step. For the first time, Crestwood's residents felt that their voices carried weight, that justice was no longer just a concept, but a reality within reach. One evening, Nia Caldwell walked through the city, her steps purposeful but unhurried. She took in the sights and sounds of the community she had fought so hard to protect. The streets, once symbols of tension and fear, now pulsed with life. Children's laughter echoed in the air as families picnicked under the shade of newly planted trees. Neighbors stood on porches, exchanging smiles and conversation. As she wandered, Nia found herself drawn to a particular park, the same park where she had once run in the early mornings, where she had first sensed the silent threat of those who opposed her. She stopped at the tree where she had been tied on that terrifying night. The sight of it sent a wave of emotions crashing over her. The memories of pain and fear were vivid, but they no longer defined her. In their place was a quiet pride and a sense of peace. She had survived, and through her resilience, the city was beginning to heal. The next morning, Nia stood on a small stage at a citywide event celebrating the progress Crestwood had made. The sun shone brightly overhead, casting a warm glow over the diverse crowd that had gathered. Faces she recognized from protests, community meetings, and long nights of planning looked back at her with pride and gratitude. She took a deep breath and began, her voice steady and warm. "Today, we gather not as victims, but as survivors," she said, her words ringing out over the crowd. "We gather as people who refused to be silenced, who stood up against injustice, and who demanded better, for ourselves, for our families, and for our city." The crowd erupted into cheers, their applause a testament to the journey they had taken together. "This journey has not been easy," Nia continued, her tone resolute, "and there is still much work to be done. But today, we celebrate our progress and the power of unity. We've proven that change is possible when we stand together, and that no amount of intimidation can suppress the will of the people." Tears shimmered in the eyes of some as Nia's words resonated deeply. For too long, they had felt powerless in the face of systemic oppression, but now they saw tangible proof that their voices mattered. When the applause died down, Nia leaned into the microphone, her voice taking on a determined edge. "Our journey is far from over. There will be more obstacles, more challenges, but together we are unstoppable. Together we will build a city where justice is not just a word, but a reality. A city where every person, regardless of race, gender, or background, is treated with dignity and respect." The crowd's cheers were deafening, echoing through the streets like a battle cry. Nia felt their energy fueling her resolve. This was more than a moment, it was a movement, and she knew they had reached a tipping point. In the weeks that followed, the reforms Nia and her allies had fought so hard to implement began taking root. The Oversight Committee, now firmly established, became a beacon of transparency. It investigated complaints with diligence and fairness, holding officers accountable and restoring the public's trust in the justice system. Community programs funded by City Hall revitalized neglected neighborhoods. After-school programs provided safe havens for children, while mental health resources and job training centers gave adults opportunities to thrive. The city was healing, its people growing stronger and more united with each passing day. For Nia, the scars from her ordeal were a constant reminder of the battles she had fought. Yet, they no longer brought pain. Instead, they were symbols of resilience, a testament to the strength she had found within herself. Each day, as she walked through Crestwood, she saw the impact of her fight. The city she loved was transforming, not just in its streets and buildings, but in the hearts of its people. A once divided community was now united in a shared vision of justice and equality. One evening, Nia returned to the park where her fight had begun. She stood under the tree that had once symbolized her darkest moment, now transformed into a place of light and life. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Teresa joined her, standing silently by her side. After a moment, Teresa broke the silence. "You've done it, Nia. You've changed everything." Nia shook her head, a soft smile playing on her lips. "We've done it. I couldn't have done this alone." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Nia felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. The fight wasn't over. She knew that. There would always be those who resisted change, who clung to old ways and outdated power structures. But Nia was ready. With her allies beside her and the community at her back, she would continue to fight for justice, for equality, for a future where every child in Crestwood could grow up without fear. Nia Caldwell had risen from the shadows of despair to become a beacon of hope. Her story wasn't just about surviving, it was about transforming pain into purpose, fear into strength, and division into unity. As she walked away from the tree and into the heart of her city, she knew that the fight for justice was far from over. But together, they would rise, and Crestwood would never be the same. The story of Nia Caldwell teaches us that true change requires courage, perseverance, and the power of collective action. In today's world, where injustice and systemic inequality persist, we must confront these challenges with unwavering determination. Nia's journey reminds us to use our voices, no matter how small they may seem, and to hold those in power accountable. Building alliances, amplifying marginalized voices, and staying resilient in the face of adversity are essential to progress. Change is not immediate, but with persistence, transparency, and community unity, we can create a society rooted in justice, equality, and mutual respect. Subscribe Undercover Insights channel for more meaningful and inspiring stories.